This episode is dedicated to my cousin Jason Ellis, probably the biggest Robin Williams fan I've ever known. Plus I have this sad fact to add. Jay did like Robin and committed suicide. He even did it the same way. So I'll just assume my cousin was a big fan of this film because I know how much the star of it made him laugh. Here's to you, Jay. Okay, sponsor time. Robin Williams was well known for having a cocaine problem, and if you don't believe me, just listen to his early stand-up specials or watch Mork and Mindy. But you don't have to snort like Robin did in his youth to boost your energy levels. That drug was and is illegal, not to mention expensive, but how about a drug that remains legal? Was it a drug? Anyway, and it's not very expensive. Caffeine. And you can get lots of that by ordering Sparkplug coffee. Sparkplug also offers decaf and half-calf, but whatever level of calf you ask for, you'll get the freshest, fairly traded, premium Arabica beans in Canada. You can get a vast array of blends and roasts, even rotating seasonal blends for those who like a change of pace sometimes. But you'll get whatever you order within a week, if you live in Canada or the United States of America. Canadians get what they want for free, but sadly our Yankee buddies will have to yank some dollars out of their wallets to pay for shipping. Now, what Robin Williams really wants in Mrs. Doubtfire is to get back to being a member of the Hillard Club. Well, since he'll never have that again, he could at least be a member of Sparkplug's Autopilot Coffee Club. He and you will get perks and deals, not to mention save money on every order. And he and you can even customize to get orders when it suits you or him best. And geez, man, this ain't no Coffee of the Month club. You can cancel or even just pause your membership whenever you need to. We know that life gets in the way of porch deliveries sometimes, so yeah, you'll get back to it when you get back to it. Puppets, you need to go to sparkplug.coffee/HYES, my puppets, and you will save 20% off your very next order. That HYES promo code is the key to keeping some dollars in your pocket, while also enhancing your coffee needs. Gotta enhance those needs. Enhance. All right, well, I like to promote our sponsor, but I really like to talk about classic movies, and I'm seconds away from doing that. Maestro, strike up your band, and action. Have you ever seen Mrs. Doubtfire? Hello, my dears, and thank you for making episode number 534 of Have You Ever Seen, your podcast of choice today. Or at least one of them. I can't be the only person who sometimes goes through 2 or even 3 podcasts in a single day. Anyway, every Monday and usually every other Friday, we go back into the film past and review something that just needs a reviewing. And we spoil. Only today there's no we, it's just me. I'm the guy who works at a television station but dreams of more creative outlets, just like Robin Williams in this movie, Ryan Ellis. My wife Bev and I had a nasty divorce, and now I host a TV show for kids while she's off getting cozy with James Bond. Okay, that's a lie, and that's good, because our marriage is still doing great, over 10 years in. Just great. It is, seriously. The real reason I'm doing this alone is because Bev took all the holiday Mondays off this summer, and this is still the summer, even if kids go back to school tomorrow. I heard actually some kids go back to school in August, which I did not know about until very recently. But the kids I'm aware of, September the 5th, I guess it is, tomorrow. By the way, happy Labor Day. I chose this movie partly because Robin Williams has 4 different jobs in it. He's a voiceover artist for a cartoon, he's a shipping clerk, he's a host of a popular daytime children's TV show, and he's, of course, a nanny for his own kids. Dude never stops laboring. Labor, and Labor Day for this man. When I yammer away during these solo shows, I inch my way through the story, ask several reasonably good questions, reasonably good, not always good, do impressions of famous people from time to time, and deal in a bit of tomfoolery. But first I need to establish how successful the picture was, and still is, with critics, audiences, and various awards bodies. Daniel in Drag was released 30 years ago by 20th Century Fox on November 24th, 1993. Even though I own the DVD, I saw it on Disney+, and you can too, if you're paying for Disney+. Paying too much for Disney+. The film only cost about $25 million to make, but it went on to gross just shy of $220 million domestic and over $440 million buckaroos worldwide. In other money news, Mrs. Doubtfire was second at the 1993 U.S. box office, Jurassic Park was number 1 that year, The Fugitive was 4th, Sleepless in Seattle was 5th, and Schindler's List was 9th. We've covered all those flicks, in fact. They're in the archive somewhere. This was such a hit that it's 187th on Box Office Mojo's Top 200, and it's 103rd on Box Office Mojo when you adjust for inflation. Inflation, ugh, what an ugly word these days. Robin Williams' animated film Aladdin is 104th, by the way. About $2 million behind Mrs. D. And Aladdin came out in 1992, so Robin was at his money-making peak back in the early 90s. The Rotten Tomatoes critics like Chris Columbus's movie, yes, but it's not a fresh tomato by all that much. It has 70% positive reviews from those critics with an average of 5.9 out of 10. There are 54 write-ups on the site. 77% of audiences like it too. And when I say that it's not even quite an average of 6 out of 10 from those critics, but 70% gave it a positive review of some kind, that tells you this had plenty of, I guess we could call them doubters. A lot of the ones that gave it a thumbs up must have just raved in comparison to balance that out, because some would have said barely. You know what I'm saying? I think you get the idea. The average is important, actually, to mention that. Sometimes they don't track the average and the actual positive percentage. This won an Oscar for Greg Kenham, V. Neal, and Yolanda Tussing? Don't know that name very well, for their makeup and hair. I guess hair being included as part of that award was a new thing in 1994, but the 1993 movies, according to V. Neal in her speech. Kenham, by the way, won 4 Oscars in total, including the year before for Dracula, the Francis Coppola version, while Neal has won 3 times in total, including the following year for Ed Wood. So those 2 people were on the stage 3 years in a row. Not together all the time, but a combination of the 2 of them. Robin Williams won some awards for this work, including the Golden Globe in the comedy category, but he didn't get to line up against Hopkins, Fishburne, Neeson, Day-Lewis, and Hanks for Best Actor at the Oscars, because comedy. Should he have been up for an Academy Award for this? Well, it wouldn't have been a bad choice. It's certainly a committed, funny, heartfelt performance, and he gets to do something I always love. His character has to act for the other characters in the movie. We and the main character know something that the others don't know. One more thing about Robin winning the Globe is that Pierce Brosnan, who plays his rival in this movie, presented it along with Laura Dern, so that was a nice little bit of kismet. And not surprisingly, Robin gave a funny speech. The Doubts was ranked 67th on the American Film Institute's, I always mess that up, I'm not going to cut this out, American Film Institute's Top 100 Laughs. Aerosmith's Dude Looks Like a Lady, that wasn't very good, was it? Was also nominated for the Top 100 Songs. Maybe some would say that song is aged badly or is in bad taste, but cram it. We're not all soothsayers who could see how the majority of people would view the world 30 years later. And anyone judging bad thoughts people had about trans issues 30 years ago, including the son in this movie who doesn't take it well when he finds out his dad is dressing up as a woman, well, they need to borrow Doc's DeLorean, Doc, to see how wrong they will be in 30 more years about some of the things they think and say now. I've made this rant before, but I thought I should address this issue. I'm not going to do it after this little diatribe, in fact. Robin Williams dressing up as a 60-year-old woman. I don't think it's controversial because of anything to do with trans. This is meant to be a comedy, one with heart, that cares about everybody in it, including Pierce Brosnan, and they're not trying to mock anybody. In fact, Brosnan's character takes the brunt of the insults and jokes at his expense, and he's certainly no underdog. Okay, so maybe that was not an issue for any of you anyway, but socially aware stuff sometimes drives me a little crazy, and I think I have to address it at the same point, so I'm probably annoying you. I'm annoying myself. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'm not going to cut this out either. Gotta calm down. Okay, so let's work our way through the plot. The film is set and was shot in Oakland, but even more so in San Francisco, which is not Robin Williams' hometown as I thought it was. Chicago is. But I believe he spent a lot of his younger life there, so the man went home when they made this thing. I think he thinks of himself as a San Francisco guy, or thought of himself. And the man plays Daniel Hillard, a journeyman actor who's recording a voice track for a cartoon parrot live in the studio, which is not how they do animation. For one thing, doing something like this live is a terrible strain on the animator's wrists. That's one of my favorite Simpsons lines. Homer says, when he's Poochie, that episode. Are we doing this live? No, Homer. It would be a terrible strain on the animator's wrists. Of course, this session could be a late-in-the-game re-recording of a voiceover track they laid down months or even years ago, and that's probably what it really is. I'm going to get a little pedantic about things in this film. That's about the first time, won't be the last. Daniel is actually giving us a preview of what he'll do in the restaurant in the climax as he plays 2 characters at the same time here, and he's going to do it in the restaurant. He does the voice of the bird and the cat antagonist in this tune, you see. He's clearly enjoying himself doing all this, too, until his morals get in the way once the cat gives the more than willing to smoke parrot a cigarette to enjoy before he dies. A little grim. The director has probably dealt with the Dan man's pushback before because he isn't having it. The tech guys in the sound booth don't agree with Daniel taking such a hardline moral stance either, since they themselves are chain-smoking in the next room. Good gag. So Daniel burns a bridge and quits on the spot. Morals! Lydia, his oldest kid, figures out immediately how Dad is able to pick up her brother Chris, and her sister Natalie after school. He didn't get fired at least, but quitting is the same difference in the eyes of their mother, and she knows that. She's predicting that. She's going to be right. And Danny must have cut out of work pretty early in the day because he's arranged a gigantic birthday party for Chris. There are kids, balloons, and animals everywhere. Polly Holiday plays their testy neighbor, although she's barely in this, and she's mad at the ruckus, so she rats out Danny by calling Miranda at work. Of course, Sally Field scored the role of Miranda Hillard, and they don't waste time having her be mad. She's mad a lot in this flick. She goes home to the Rager, and geez, how many kids did they invite to this thing? I think the whole school is there. And we thought the outside of the house was nuts. Inside, everybody is jumping around. Everybody jump, jump, jump. And Daniel is the ringleader. Here's the first example of Robin Williams being capable of showing deep pain in his usually smiling face, because he knows he's in real trouble with the wife. I get the feeling they've had this fight many times, only this time, it's over! It's over, Daniel! She's fed up with having to deal with 4 children, not just 3, and she wants a divorce. Oh, and I should say in my pedantic way that this argument takes place inside, but an establishing shot outside after the party's over with but leading into the fight shows they got that cleaned up really fast. There's no evidence of anyone ever being outside, and yet it's still the same day. It's maybe, an hour later, probably less. Daniel crashes at his brother Frank's house. Frank is Harvey Fierstein, who's playing a very out gay man who lives, I can't do his voice, who lives with a dude named Jack. Danny is wrong when he tells Frank and his husband Jack, or is it Aunt Jack? I guess Aunt Jack, that's a joke later on, that Miranda will change her mind because we go from that assurance to the divorce proceedings. Because he doesn't have a job anymore or even a house fit for kids, she gets full custody and he only gets to see them on Saturdays. His goodbye to the kids is sad, naturally, but what almost got me was when Lydia simply says, "I'll miss you." I'm going to talk a few times about how good Lisa Jacob is in this movie, and that was one of her best moments. Say the line quietly, great sadness, and also a fair amount of disappointment. Don't overdo it. Very well done. You know she'll take care of the other 2 because she's the oldest, but what a burden to put on what already seems to be a bit of a tortured kid. The kids are always together, it seems, in this movie, much like the Belcher kids on Bob's Burgers, but it's pretty believable. And both of them really do take care of Natty. She is, I think, 5 years old or something. When Robin was big acting his way through Mork and Mindy back in the 70s, and man was he big, the writers would just leave a space or even spaces in the scripts where it would say Robin improvises or Robin goes off. They must have done that in this too, because when Daniel's caseworker asks if he has any special skills, he goes into a rapid-fire montage of impressions and jokes. It's always cracked me up when he says he does a great impression of a hot dog and just straightens up his body with a goofy look on his face. It looks nothing like a hot dog, and yet it also does. I didn't laugh a lot watching this a few days ago, but I did smile a bunch. Case in point, right here. Daniel does get a job at a television studio, but he's not going to get to be creative. He, for some reason, didn't realize he's going to be a shipping clerk. Shouldn't someone have made that clear to him before he got there? Didn't he apply for a job, probably this specific job in the first place, and then accepted that this is the job? Comedy. Miranda, however, is hitting the big time in her job. Pierce Brosnan walks into her life, or back in, since they knew each other before, and there were and still are sparks. She's an interior designer, and she's clearly doing well because A, look at her house, and B, when the secretary answers the phone, Hillard is one of the names that owns the company. The secretary says that. 2 other names, I didn't write them down, but then Hillard. Or she's at least a partner. Miranda is going to design a house for the Stewster. She talks business, but all he can do is hit on her. I guess she's the one that got away. This man is a Greek god, or an Irish god. He's so dreamy here in 1993. I'm just going to sit here for a second and dream about Pierce Brosnan in 1993. Okay, done. No wonder the studio wanted the guy to play James Bond before they settled for Tim Dalton in the 80s. Of course, they would get Brosnan to play Jimmy B 2 years later. I didn't love all the 007 flicks he made, especially that last one, but I think he was one of the best Bonds. Anyway, the first Saturday night we see at Daniel's new place doesn't go well. His apartment is a sty, and he's ordered Chinese food rather than provide the tykes with a healthy meal. Miranda shows up to pick them up an hour early, which enrages Daniel. I'm not a child of divorce, but I did grow up in a house with a lot of yelling, and I've certainly heard a father do some roaring when he's cheesed off. There's a reason Williams was raved about for his work in this flick. He really shows his range with, yes, the shticky comedy, but also the sadness and now the anger. We wouldn't have a movie if Miranda would just take Daniel up on his offer to be the one to take care of the kids every day after school, which is the arrangement they make at the end of the film. Of course, if she could just have gotten over her fury at this man and let him do what she knows he'd be great at, not the most responsible, but still, she knows he loves these kids, then the world would never have met Mrs. Doubtfire. So you need that, of course, so there's no mover. In any case, Miranda wants a housekeeper and someone to watch the kids for 3 or 4 hours each day, so she's placing an ad, which Daniel manages to alter by changing her work and home phone numbers without her noticing. The kids don't notice that either. Nobody does, just us. Then Robin does another sticky bit by calling Miranda several times, putting on voices and scaring the hell out of his ex-wife by making it seem like these applicants are terrible. And of course, he's the only one who can call her because he changed the number. I'm on that. I got it. Did you get it? Because I got it. I'm smart. And she doesn't recognize his voice? Robin never really did mask his own voice when he did impressions, and he sounds a lot like himself in this scene, too, or this montage as well. Anyway, he calls her one last time, and this time puts on a womanly British accent and acts like the perfect applicant. Worked for the Smythe family, not Smith, dear. Of course, this is Mrs. Doubtfire. He gets the name Mrs. Doubtfire from an ad in his newspaper that says the words, "Police doubt fire" was intentional. But wait, you don't make sure you have a fake name all loaded up and ready to go before you call her? Comedy. Comedy. In a lucky break, Jack and Frank are makeup artists, so next we go through a series of makeup and wigs that basically just make Robin look like himself, but in gaudy makeup and a wig. This allows our guy to scat some more as different older women. Wait, scat? Is that about something else? To bebop, to improvise, obviously. But they realize they can't just throw a fake nose and a hairpiece on a man who was married for 14 years to the woman he wants to deceive, and also the 5 o'clock shadow thing that Jack points out. They need a full-on mask and a fat suit. When they finally get it right, Jack and Frank's reaction is to say that Daniel is pretty much the spitting image of their mother. But I like that we don't see him as Mrs. Doubtfire just yet, only from behind. Chris Columbus is saving the reveal for when Miranda opens the door the night the family first meets her. Of course, if you saw the trailers and posters, you already saw what Robin looked like in the makeup, but still, pretty decent little bit of filmmaking there. The first meeting with Doubtfire and the family goes well. Doubtfire charms Natty and Chris right off as the old British lady. Although I love that Lydia is no more than just polite. She actually wonders out loud why their dad can't just take care of them. What I love is that even though Daniel has gone to all this trouble, he asks Miranda the same question, as Doubtfire, of course. Maybe their father should just be the one to take care of them. But that's not going to fly because, as we'll learn at the end, Miranda is still angry. It's been many months, but her rage lingers. Which is strange because she got what she wanted by getting out of the marriage. Why is she angry? Daniel should be. He didn't want out of the marriage. Also, Miranda says to Mrs. Doubtfire that Daniel needs to get a job and an apartment before he can be trusted to take care of the kids, but she doesn't know he does have a job now. You'd think he'd tell her that as soon as he started there because he needs to have a job and a good house to get joint custody of the kids. Plus, she knows he does have a place to live, even though it's a mess. This isn't always the tightest screenplay. Anyway, Daniel as Doubtfire gets to be passive-aggressive about the home decorating Miranda has done, but also how organized everything is in her kitchen. It's a good little bit. He never complains about the fact their house is a palace compared to what he would probably like to live in. But you get it here that he probably always had a little bit of resentment for the fact that, yes, she's an interior decorator, but this isn't his style. It's hers. Look, Daniel, I sympathize with your situation. It's tough. For the most part, you're more right than she is about the way she's handling this. But I'm a Miranda man in this case. You got to keep a clean and organized kitchen. You just have to. Somehow a woman who spent nearly 2 decades with this man doesn't recognize his eyes, or even the face. The makeup in this picture won the Oscar. Yeah, deserved it. But a person who knows this guy this well really should be able to recognize who's under the mask. Anyway, I just thought of something. Is that a hint that maybe she wasn't even looking at her husband for the last couple of years because she was so fed up? She forgot what he looked like, in a way. Probably not. Anyway, Mrs. D gets the gig, so Daniel leaves his old home, kvetching about his high heels on the way to his new home. But just then, his caseworker, Mrs. Sellner, drops by to check out the place. Robin gets to play some classic comedy stuff here as he plays both Daniel and Doubtfire up in the apartment, albeit not on screen at the same time, of course, going through a whole wealth of body-related puns as he strips off Euphigenia's costume, mask, and teeth. That's the first name, of course. You probably knew that. Euphigenia Doubtfire, dear, which is spelled E-U-P-H-E-G-E-N-I-A. Don't think I've ever heard that name other than in this movie. This is a fairly typical 90s movie where most of the faces are white, but one way to get some variety into the cast is to have 2 little Asian boys be Daniel's neighbors across the street. They watch him put the Doubtfire costume back on and giggle about how ridiculous he looks. He tries to shut the blinds quickly, but that knocks the dummy head that holds the mask into the street, and then the mask gets crushed by a truck. Daniel improvises a face by placing his own into a heavily frosted cake, covering as much of his puss as he can. Hello! Can't get that high. I tried. I always love when parts of the icing fall into Mrs. Sellner's tea and Doubtfire says, "There you've got your sugar and your cream." And somehow Danny Boy gets through this without being found out. Robin improvised this scene, by the way, just like he did on a lot of his comedies. He improvised throughout the whole movie, so it makes sense that he'd do that a lot in a movie he produced and starred in. On what I guess is Doubtfire's first day on the job, Lydia tests the housekeeper in a way that she wouldn't have had to when Daniel was just being their dad, because I think that guy would have always just caved. Euphigenia, though, says no more TV and tosses the remote into the fish tank. Lydia keeps pushing, so the 3 tykes are punished by having to do chores while Dad in disguise gets to read the paper and enjoy a cold drink. They finally cave and go up to do their homework, which allows Daniel time to burn and ruin dinner so badly that he has to order 4 fancy meals from a fine dining establishment. And Daniel proves here he at least always knew how to be fancy the way Miranda would have wanted because he sets a wonderful table with that meal. He was capable of it. After he heads out and allows them to eat, Lydia rushes outside to apologize for being a snot. She's obviously going through something. Understandably, they all are. It's a lovely scene, though, and another example of how good Lisa Jacob is in this flick, and how restrained Robin had to be to not overplay this moment, because, of course, he's tortured by the fact his daughter is talking to what she thinks is a stranger, not her own dad. I like to explain these things to you. You knew this, didn't you? Dude looks like a lady. And we get a montage as Daniel as Doubtfire lives up to the earlier claim that she used to play soccer, just like Chris does. Ooh, goal! We see them all riding bikes, too, plus Doubtfire dancing while vacuuming and sweeping up. The joy of performance. Ebert talked about that. You get it here with Robin. He seems a little too happy, though, considering he probably doesn't want to be doing this, but then again, he gets to see his kids every day. But what I like best in this montage is when you see Daniel at home watching a cooking show. He's taking this job very seriously, and he needs to learn how to cook if he doesn't want to go broke buying takeout every night. Which brings me to my movie in a nutshell. So, Mrs. Doubtfire, in a nutshell. Euphegenia Poppins. Just like Mary Poppins, Daniel does everything well, especially when he's playing a woman. If he had just applied himself half as well as he does when he's in disguise, he never would have alienated his wife. Anyway, Stu gets the chance to meet the Doubts, but the Irishman's charm is wasted on Daniel in disguise, who rips the strapping suitor to pieces with some barbs that would get him socked in the mush if Stu knew who was actually saying these things to him. Mrs. Doubtfire even tells Miranda that she should never go out with Stu or even have relations with anyone again. Anyone, other than her husband, which is one hell of a conflict of interest coming from her ex-husband. I guess it's later that night when Daniel is outed to the kids because Chris walks in on him peeing while standing up. To steal a line from Judge Reinhold in Fast Times, "Doesn't anybody knock anymore?" Well, he swears in that scene, but I'm not going to swear in this episode. Chris shrieks at Lydia that she's a he-she, and they're ready to call the cops. Although, kids, if this was just a trans person who didn't explain that to you, even in 1993, do you have to lose your minds like this? Well, I said I wasn't getting into the politics of it again, but I'll make that one point there. Anyway, comedy. And so Daniel fesses up who's been posing as their caretaker all this time, but only to the two older kids. Natty wouldn't be able to keep the secret. Daniel cracking jokes to Jonathan Lundy about the boring educational dinosaur show being filmed becomes our man's big break. Lundy is the GM of the station, and he's played pretty well by Robert Prosky. I like the notion here, too, that the big boss is getting somebody to talk to him for real because, of course, for some reason, Robin doesn't know this is his boss. I'm guessing this guy likes hearing the honest truth sometimes. The boss has planned to scrap the show altogether since it's terrible and nobody watches it. That break I talked about, that's going to come later. During a heart-to-heart with Miranda while putting away groceries, Robin gets to tell one of his better jokes by saying, as Doubtfire, of course, that the drink killed her husband, but he wasn't an alcoholic. He was hit by a Guinness truck, so it was quite literally the drink that killed him. That's a good gag. The scene gets serious, though, when Miranda confesses the issues she had living with Daniel, including that she cried herself to sleep many times, which seems to devastate him. Can you imagine not only hearing your ex talk about you like this, and not being a jerk about it, but just being honest with their housekeeper, to you? You know this is the unvarnished truth that you'd never get even in couples therapy. Sally Field is terrific in this scene, but Robin's great too, working his magic through that mask. He has to let us know how much this is messing him up, without letting it be obvious to her. And he doesn't say much. This is mostly Field monologuing. Randy, Mayim Singer, and Leslie Dixon are, of course, women. You probably guessed that. But, well, Randy could be a guy's name, but Leslie. Again, explaining. And I've already beefed about some parts of their script, and I'll beef some more later. But they did a wonderful job with the honesty in this scene. Very touching stuff. I really like this scene a lot. Now, why Daniel would agree to go to Stu's club when he has to wear the Doubtfire costume, I'll never know. Wait, comedy. He should probably sweat through all that stuff on a normal day, never mind a hot day by the pool. Our man in his woman getup sits miserably at the bar watching Stu play basketball with the kids in the pool. But a minute later, Dan overhears Stu badmouth him while waiting for drinks. Doubtfire hiding behind a plant. Not very believable, but okay. At least Stu must legitimately like Miranda and the kids because he says as much to the friend at the bar, and he'd have no reason to lie to this dude, who doesn't look like a lady. But one of the best jokes in the whole movie is when Doubtfire throws a lime at the back of Stu's head and then claims to have seen the run-by fruiting, speculating that it was an angry member of the kitchen staff who didn't get tipped properly. Tipped, and resorted to throwing citrus at handsome club members. Stu really should hate this woman by this point because, understandable or not, Euphegenia is always awful to him. Hey, it's Mr. Lundy again. I told you he'd be back. It's late at night after work, and Robin gets to riff again as he plays with Mr. Sprinkles' dinosaur toys. Wait, doesn't he have to go take care of the kids every single night? I guess you could argue that maybe Miranda has them sometimes after school. Anyway, the boss is watching this, and Lundy wants to hear more about what Daniel could do with the time slot by making an informational show actually be fun and funny. James Brontosaurus. I eat wood. It tastes good. Dun, 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 dun. Meanwhile, Danny has turned his life around enough that his place looks great, and now he's making quality meals for the little uns, not just ordering in. I like that Miranda just knocks this time and is in great spirits, doesn't barge into his place. But Daniel still doesn't get to take over as the kid's caregiver. Again, nice touch that as good as he is as their maid, he doesn't want to keep doing it. But now the problem is that Miranda can't imagine life without Effie. Daniel was too good at playing the character, and now Mrs. Doubtfire is Mrs. Indispensable. Okay, sitcom plot time, but we do need a major unlikelihood for the zany climax to happen. Mrs. Doubtfire gets invited to Miranda's birthday party at Bridges' restaurant, the same night and the same time as Daniel's dinner meeting with his boss at Bridges' restaurant. Lundy's secretary can't fit Danny in any other time and suggests he not cancel because he'll blow a big opportunity. Although I got thinking about this. Lundy loved what he saw Daniel doing with the dinosaur toys, and he really wants the show to be good, So wouldn't he be willing to make time for someone with this much potential if he thinks the guy can make the show good, but he can't make this one meeting on a Friday night? Okay, right, comedy. Incidentally, this movie is G-rated, but there's plenty of objectionable language in it. No F-bombs, but a lot of stuff that should get you worse than a G. And Doubtfire goes on an extended riff about Stu's expectations with Miranda after he gives her an expensive bracelet for her birthday. It's sexually suggestive, and again, G-rated for that? Probably shouldn't have been. Burgess Meredith did the same thing in the outtakes of Grumpy Old Men. I think that came out only about a month after this did, in fact. So that was the year of sexual euphemisms by, well, one person playing an old person, but two old people, basically. But back to the scene. Robin gets to work off Pierce a lot through all this, and I swear that even a pro like Brosnan came close to laughing at Williams' antics, including losing his fake old lady teeth and his wine. Carpe dentum, seize the teeth. Of course, Danny, who's been pounding scotch with Lundy when he's in his Daniel outfit, drunkenly decides to mess with Stu by sneaking into the kitchen and dumping some cayenne pepper onto Stu's jambalaya. That's because Daniel heard Stu say he's allergic to pepper. Ask my sister-in-law, don't mess with allergies. All those double scotches get to Dan's head and he goes to the wrong table, sitting down at Lundy's table and talking as Daniel while wearing the Doubtfire getup. He's busted, but comes up with the idea on the spot of telling Lundy that this is his idea, to do the kid show as a hip old granny. But that pitch is interrupted when he sees and hears Stu choking to death over on the other side of the restaurant. Daniel had said earlier in the movie that he, Mrs. Doubtfire, knew all kinds of emergency procedures, including the Heimlich maneuver, which eventually pops the full piece of shrimp out of Stu's gullet, but that happens more because the two of them fall over than it does from a proper de-choking technique. I don't think he was doing it right. But oh man, no, the old lady mask finally peels off. The jig is up, and Miranda is understandably outraged. Of course, give it 5 seconds of thought, you realize that when they do makeup like this in movies, they're touching up that makeup all day long, when especially an actor does anything physical. So the soccer scene should have dislodged the makeup, but okay. I guess it's been about 90 days because they're back to court to figure out the long-term custody of the kids. Robin's heartfelt plea to be able to be with his children feels like something this guy might have had to go through when he got divorced for real several years earlier. Art imitates Robin's life. But the judge isn't having it. He thinks the man is a gifted actor, but has terrible judgment. And he's probably right about that. The judge thinks Daniel needs therapy and can't be trusted to be around the kids without supervision. The key here in this scene is Sally Field, although Williams is awesome in his little monologue to the judge. But Field just listens and doesn't say anything. You can tell she knows the judge's decision is wrong and way too harsh, no matter how mad she is at him for the Doubtfire deception. The whole time! The kids are depressed that they don't get to see their dad or Mrs. Doubtfire anymore, but the TV is on while they're making dinner. Although strangely, they didn't hear it before now. And it's Dad playing Doubtfire on TV. Lundy liked the crazy pitch enough to go with it, and the show is a hit. Makes you wonder, though, that he probably would have seen the mask come off during the whole choking thing with Stu, and then Daniel probably had to go over there and tell him, I don't know what he would have told him. I guess they're both drunk enough that Lundy didn't care, and the show could work, so whatever you're doing in your personal life, I don't care. So Daniel got his own TV show, but he didn't even tell his kids about it? This is how they find out? Miranda stops by the studio, and they have another painful heart-to-heart that, not this time, but other times, has yanked the salty discharge out of my eye holes. She decides to let him be the kid's after-school nanny after all. Both actors are great in this scene, another good serious scene. Sally Field only gets to be funny a few times in this film, but she really aces the serious stuff, especially right here. And look how inclusive this new educational show is. Mrs. Doubtfire says that a makeup artist named Frank will be on the next show, so Frank, his brother, gets to be on TV and promote his brand. And we see that Mr. Sprinkles, the boring geezer who hosted the old show, is Mrs. D's mailman. I like that. The old guy lost his job, but they found a role for him doing this instead. And pluck the heartstrings as the kids find out that Dad's going to be their new caretaker. We don't see Stu again after that fiasco in the restaurant, so maybe he and Miranda didn't keep dating. But I like that there's not much hint that the Hillards are going to get back together. That's life. Divorce is usually permanent in reality, unless you're Burton and Taylor. And maybe in time, Dan and Moran can even be nice to each other. They are in this scene. It's a nice device that the last scene in the movie, with Daniel taking the kids to his house, but on screen with her, less dialogue in a way, is Miranda effectively listening to Daniel explain divorce to one of the viewers who sent in a letter. So, of course, as Mrs. Doubtfire explained that a divorce doesn't mean the kid did anything wrong. That happened earlier in this movie, of course. Chris blamed himself for the birthday party. I shouldn't have had a birthday. And Daniel says, you didn't do anything wrong. This is not you at all. It's none of your fault. It's mine. It's ours, your parents. Anyway, Doubtfire says on the air the family will be fractured, but they can make it work as long as there's love, because those are the ties that bind. Well, those and really strong shoelaces. I think this is part of the stuff that Bev would have hated. I've liked a lot of the serious stuff, and I've been touched by this ending before too, but I can see her just snorting at that. If there's love, dear, those are the ties that bind. So the cast. We hadn't covered Robin Williams on this channel a single time during our first 8 years, but now we've talked about 4 of his titles in the past 2 or 3. He had a voiceover role in AI, he was nominated for Best Actor for The Fisher King, and then he won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for Good Will Hunting. We did that last year. Of course, he was a stand-up comedy legend way back when, then became a TV star in Mork and Mindy, and then a box office sensation in movies. He was actually a pretty great character actor all through that time, too. Yeah, he mugged and overdid it in his comedies and really started to fall back on shtick as he got older, but he was lovable, he seemed to care about people, and holy God, could he be funny. His death really stung a lot of people, probably more than most celebrity deaths do. Partly because it was a suicide, yes, but he just seemed to be one of those people who was always trying to make the world a nicer place. Getting a little bit choked up here. He was always trying to make the world a nicer place. What a tragedy to lose him at all. Oh, man. I didn't think this was going to make me emotional like this. What a tragedy to lose him at all, but especially the way that we did. I guess I'm thinking about my cousin, too. Okay. He's often hitting home runs in this movie, but at this point in my life, I prefer the serious scenes, I guess I've made that pretty clear, to the wacky comedy. I just didn't laugh at the gags very much, but I was always touched by the dramatic stuff. Robin went through 2 divorces himself and already had one in the books at this point, so he was clearly able to draw on real feelings and possibly even real arguments. Maybe this is the most personal movie he made in his entire career. Sally Field is now 76 and has been working since the mid-60s. The 2-time Oscar winner was in Forrest Gump the year after this, Gump, which is the only time she's come up on Have You Ever Seen before now. I like her. I really like her. And I find her very relatable in what could have been the shrill, mean ex-wife role. It isn't hard to see her point of view, though. Plus, she really does the right thing for Daniel and the kids at the end of the movie. They all need this badly, not just him. Too bad she couldn't get over being so mad at him sooner, although he wouldn't have had this great gig on TV if he never put on the mask and the fat suit to be her nanny. 2 years after this, Pierce Brosnan did his first Bond movie in one of my favorite Bond flicks, GoldenEye. The Thick Soup has been in about 100 films and TV shows, but Thick Soup, that was a good gag too. Stew, not really a name, it's more of a thick soup. But this is the first time we've talked about one of his projects. He's handsome and suave in Mrs. Doubtfire, but I like that he was never a terrible jerk-face to Daniel. He told his friend at the pool bar that the guy is a loser, yeah, but it's not like Daniel as Daniel was lighting the world on fire at that time. He was a bit of a loser. And it would have been easy to make Stu a villain who will do anything to keep Daniel away from his kids, but I don't get the feeling that he'd ever really try to do that, or that Miranda would let him. One more thing about Brosnan, an underrated movie I suggest you check out is Seraphim Falls. Seraphim, S-E-R-A-P-H-I-M, and then Falls, a mid-2000s Western he did with Liam Neeson. Robert Prosky was in The Natural and Rudy, 2 films you can find in the archives of my now defunct sports movie podcast, Scoring at the Movies. He also has one of my favorite lines in movie history in Broadcast News, a film we covered several years ago, one of my favorite 80s comedies. And I like it so much, mostly because of the way journalists today act like know everythings, and we all must need to know their opinion on everything, which isn't journalism, it's editorializing, and they almost all seem to do it anymore. Anyway, what he says in response to William Hurt saying live on the air that I think we're going to be okay is, who cares what you think? Exactly. I get you're probably thinking that's not that great a line, but just for me personally, my experiences being in a TV station and watching this stuff for so long, I'm with you on that one, Robert Prosky. Harvey Fierstein had that funny cameo playing off of Jeff Goldblum in Independence Day before aliens ruined his day. So this marks just the second time he's come up around these podcast parts. Harvey's a very likable guy, and who can ever forget that voice? He's got a small role in Bros, which Bev and I saw a few weeks ago, and I think that's the first movie he's been in a long time. The movie has a lot of gay actors in it, so they really had to cast Harvey Fierstein if you're going to do that. If he's alive and wants to do it, you got to put him in the movie somehow. Lisa Jacob worked a lot in the 90s, but hasn't made anything, TV or film, in 23 years. She was in Independence Day with Fierstein, but they didn't share any scenes together, just as they don't in this, even though he's playing her uncle. Joey's brother Matthew Lawrence, is Chris. He did a lot of stuff on TV, a lot of Drek, and a lot of titles you probably wouldn't recognize, but he did get to be in another legendary comedy 6 years earlier. He's Steve Martin's son, Neil Jr. in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I prefer noogies. The adorable Mara Wilson was in all kinds of big projects in this era. This was her movie debut, but then it was The Miracle on 34th Street remake the following year, and Matilda a few years after that, but she's mostly done TV shows since the turn of the century. Man, was she cute in this movie, and you can see why both Daniel and Stu are crazy about her. Their director, Chris Columbus, is one of the most financially successful filmmakers of the last 30 or even 40 years, even if he's never really shown us any personal style as a filmmaker. I've barely talked about him until now, so it's partly that he makes big-time successful movies, sometimes pretty good ones, too. But does he have a style? Not really. You don't watch one of his movies and say, now that's classic Chris Columbus. CC directed Home Alone, which we covered. Then he did Home Alone 2 and the first 2 Harry Potters. He also wrote Gremlins and the Goonies back in the mid-'80s, We talked about Gremlins a few years ago, but something I really want you to try to see, if you haven't already, is Only the Lonely. Only the Lonely. It wasn't one of Columbus's huge hits, but John Candy is at his best in that. Well, Planes, Trains, okay, his second best in Only the Lonely. Plus Maureen O'Hara and Ali Sheedy are pretty great in that too. The screenplay was based on Anne Fine's 1987 book, Madame Doubtfire, although it says on the IMDb, alias Madame Doubtfire. The two women who adapted Anne Fine's book were Randy Mayim Singer and Leslie Dixon. Singer only had a hand in a few other movie scripts. This was her debut. She's become a producer of television shows. Dixon has been involved in a lot of comedies of varying quality and success, but she had a hand in writing the 2007 musical Hairspray, so she's A-OK in my books for that, and for this too. Oh, also, Hairspray on Broadway, the musical, I believe Harvey Fierstein played, what's her name again? Did John Travolta role? Edna Turnblad. Connection there. Edna. Robin Williams was a producer on this movie. I don't think he produced a lot of things, but he did this, as was his wife, Marcia. I mentioned he got divorced twice, and she was divorce number 2. They were together for 20 years, though, at least. I think I read that she was his nanny before they hooked up, so this movie really was personal to them. Howard Shore composed the music, which Bev would be saying she hated if she was sitting here right now. I think it's fair to say that Shore is a legend in composing, though, with Lord of the Rings, but also what he's done with Cronenberg and Scorsese. Donald McAlpine was the cinematographer on Mrs. Doubtfire. He also shot Predator, Parenthood, which we've covered, and he got his only Oscar nomination working with Baz Luhrmann on Moulin Rouge. Raja Gosnell edited. Did I say that right? I think it's Raja Gosnell. The Goss had cut Home Alone for Columbus 3 years before this, but he also sliced up Pretty Woman and Rookie of the Year. Bev and I discussed Pretty Woman about 3 years ago, while Chris and I tore Rookie of the Year to pieces on Scoring at the Movies some time back. Gosnell and Columbus had to sift through a lot of stuff in the edit suite to make Mrs. Doubtfire coherent because Robin Williams gave them so much material with all his improvs, but a lot of it was just too blue to make it into the final cut of a G-rated movie. And I'll say again that there's plenty of off-color language that, no, shouldn't have gotten them an R for this family film, but probably a PG. Not that I should care either way. I'm 49, I don't have kids, and I swear all the time. Not today, in this episode, but usually all the time. Okay, to sum it up, the film is not perfect by any means, and you heard me criticize some huge flaws in logic, but I used to laugh at Mrs. Doubtfire a lot before I got to know it so well. It's part of the problem, is I know the jokes so well. Only the real best comedies will make you laugh always. Even if it isn't one of the funniest movies ever made, and it's just not, it's got that enormous heart. I like it. One reason I didn't laugh all that often is because I've seen so many Robin Williams movies and stand-up specials as well that I've heard him repeat the same jokes and do the same impressions. It was a shtick he relied on a lot when he did award shows as well. But this is a fun movie, and I'm sure you're a fan of it if you bother listening to me talk about it for this long. I probably won't check it out again for a long time, although I bet I'll look up some of those serious scenes on YouTube from time to time. So that was Mrs. Doubtfire. Next Monday, Bev will be back on the microphone and we'll be changing it up drastically. While this movie had plenty of dramatic scenes, it was still a comedy. United 93 isn't funny, though, and that will be our movie next week, partly because next Monday is 9/11. As for the next show I do on my own, it won't be this coming Friday. Since I'd have to be watching and recording the episode in August to get it ready in time for the 8th, I would just rather enjoy the last remnants of the summer. So I'll do only one Friday show in September. That'll be on the 22nd. Now, do you feel like telling us what you think of this podcast? Blast us, compliment us, somewhere in between? I have an outlet for you. Email. We're haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. Or on Twitter, we are @MovieFiend51 or @BevEllisEllis. You can tell us what you think of us in those ways, sure, but you can also tell us what you think on YouTube. Our podcasts always go up there, usually several hours later, sometimes the next morning, but at some point the same day we post a podcast in the app, it goes on YouTube. You can hit up @HYESEllis in your browser, or just type "Have You Ever Seen" into the YouTube search bar. What you'll get there is, or subscribe, then you miss an episode. What you'll get there is exactly what you get here, but maybe people would like to hear what we say that way, rather than on a podcast app. I've done that before, podcast on YouTube rather than on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or what have you. So rate, write a review, comment, like, share, subscribe, spread the word about Have You Ever Seen? So that's that. Thank you, my dears, for hearing me ramble on about Euphegenia Doubtfire. See you soon, you wicked, wicked monkeys. Take care. Bye-bye. And cut my puppets.